Welcome to the Rejected Religion podcast. I'm Stephanie Shea. This month's guest is Stewart Clelland, who joined me to talk about all things Freemasonry, plus his new book called The Green Book of the Élus Coëns. Stewart is a teacher of philosophy and religious studies in and around the northeast of Scotland, and holds a master's degree in Western esotericism from the University of Exeter, a PGDE in Religious, Moral, and Philosophical Studies from the University of Aberdeen, as well as a BA with honors in Fine Art and Philosophy from the University of Dundee. Taken from his website, Stewart's research background is centered on esoteric spirituality and the practice of heterodox religious traditions with a particular interest in marginalized and persecuted religious communities, both historical and contemporary. His work engages with religious studies, specifically in the so-called Western esoteric tradition or Hermetic tradition in religious and philosophical thought. His new book, The Green Book of the Élus Coëns, offers an insight into a Masonic society called the Order of Knight Mason Elect Coëns of the Universe, one of the most elite and esoteric groups within Masonic societies. The book is an English translation of the grimoire that this group used. Stewart will talk more about this group in part 2. However, in part 1, Stewart starts by talking about the diverse views of what Freemasonry is and how influential Freemasonry has been to other esoteric and occult societies. I also asked Stewart to give his opinions about why Freemasonry is a common target for conspiracy theorists, especially those found within UFO conspiracies. So get ready for a very interesting look into this group. So welcome to the podcast, Stewart. It's a pleasure to have you here to talk about...
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you for having the time to talk to me today. I know you are trying to have a little summer holiday, but you're still talking about Freemasonry, but I really appreciate it. I very much would like to talk more about your new book as well in our discussion, but we're going to start with the basics first. Before we get into all of the details about your new book called The Green Book of the Élus Coëns and other topics related to Freemasonry, I thought it might be good to start out with a brief history of Freemasonry in general. And I know that Freemasonry is an incredibly broad topic. So I'm not quite certain if I'm giving you almost an impossible task to do this in a brief overview, but if you could humor me, I guess you could say, and give us an idea of what we're talking about when we talk about Freemasons, because I don't know if everyone listening has a really good foundation in that.
Yes, it's difficult. It's a broad topic. I mean, it's a topic that's always seems to be in the public discourse. But when trying to talk about it scholarly or in an academic sense, you encounter lots of problems. With any other spiritual tradition, we come to Freemasonry with our own preconceived ideas and prejudices, myself included. Masons themselves, academics, the public, they tend to describe it in ways that reflect their own ideas of what they think it should be. It could be a social club, a political society, an esoteric or occult order, or a front for corruption or human sacrifice. It could be anything to many different people. We tend to have really strong preconceptions of what Freemasonry is. Even when you ask Freemasons themselves, they'll give you different answers. People define it on their own conceptions and preconceived ideas, and this is no less so when you look into Masonic scholarship itself and the wider conversation. It's really a internally diverse system, and there's a massive amount of different interpretations, beliefs and themes. Historically, Freemasonry has always changed and evolved over time, and despite what people believe, Freemasonry doesn't really shape the world. The world shapes Freemasonry. What Freemasonry is different for different people in different places at different times, and any kind of attempt to come up with a kind of essentialized idea of what Freemasonry is tends to feed into the conspiracy narratives. The story I'm going to tell you today, it will probably be something that people disagree with because everyone has their own ideas, but my understanding of it comes from the kind of generally accepted the academic, historical, critical approach to Freemasonry. Basically, you're talking about a society or a phenomena that has its roots in the medieval stonemasons trade, fraternities, incorporations, as they're called in Scotland. And there's still widespread debate about whereabouts in Europe this phenomena finds its origins. Generally, the most historical studies of it lay all the primary sources in Scotland, coming out of the medieval stonemasons trade. Over time, the masons trade starts to bring in people to their organisations that are not what we call operative Freemasons, operative stonemasons rather, the name for the actual business of building buildings and working with stone. In Scotland, all the trades, all the working organisations would put on what was known as mystery plays or religious ceremonies, theatre that would happen out in the open. But with the Reformation, particularly in Scotland, this became something that had to be done behind closed doors. These kind of theatre plays, mystery plays, gradually evolve into kind of ritual, ceremonial initiations, which served really more practical purposes. You're talking about a time when certificates and degrees of knowledge weren't easily communicated, as the stonemasons would move across the country through handshakes and different signs and the specific words. You were able to show that you were a qualified stonemason as you travelled across the country. As time goes on, though, these organisations start to become less relevant in the kind of early modern world, and start to attract gentlemen who are interested in the history, the kind of mythology, the stories, the theatre of the initiations. Gentlemen Freemasons, as they're called, and the technical term we would use is speculative. So when we're discussing the history of Freemasonry, you have the operative stonemasons and the speculative Freemasons. Now, most would say that this happened primarily in Scotland, as in England, the stonemasons trade was slowly collapsing due to the use of brick, whereas in Scotland, stone was still being used right into the 17th century. Now, what happens is that we have a cross-pollination of ideas between Scotland and England, and whilst the historical record shows that all the primary documents, all the primary pieces of information into the 17th century come from Scotland, I think what we call Freemasonry today, the ceremonies, the particulars, come from south of the border. But it's important to realise that when we speak about Freemasonry, there is no one Freemasonry. It's Freemasonries. There's many different branches, many different ideas, and they aren't connected. There is no one monolith of Freemasonry, despite the kind of common perception. Freemasonry in Scotland is very different from Freemasonry in England, and the same of France, Italy, Spain, and there is not one overarching grand table that deals with them all. They're all independent and sovereign entities. Freemasonry is very much has its roots in a folk tradition that slowly becomes more and more elaborate, formalised, traditional, conservative. But you're talking about something that dates back to at least 1630s. That's when we have the kind of earliest evidence of what's known as the Mason's Word, which is a kind of shorthand term for the kind of esoteric spirituality of the stonemasons' lodges.
I see. And if we are looking at contemporary Freemasons, are we talking about the same thing that you just explained from centuries ago? Is it in its essence, or are we talking about more of for example, charitable organizations or things like that?
Well, it depends who you ask.
I should have known.
The Freemasons themselves will tell you that it's the same organisation. But I mean, the historical record shows an influx of speculative of gentlemen masons coming into these almost dying stonemason lodges and basically taking over, kind of co-opting the heritage and rebuilding a tradition that is quite different from what we actually would expect. There is no doubt that there were stonemasons who were working a 2-degree system, a 2-step initiation, and they were telling stories to one another. They were given handshakes and signs. But the particulars of that are completely different from what we find today. They are 2 separate things in my mind. However, it depends on how pedantic you want to be. I would certainly say that the organisation as it exists today is something that really works on the heritage and the tradition and claims that is a continuous line. However, we are talking about historical reality. There are splits, changes, revolutions. You're talking 3-4 centuries of political upheaval. Right. And that chain of initiation isn't always easy to follow. The contemporary organisations of Freemasonry, I believe, should be studied as a spiritual tradition. I think the tools that we have for religious studies are the best and most appropriate to understand it. However, there are some who would say that it is a purely charitable organisation, a social organisation, maybe even a business organisation. But that is a reaction to hundreds of years of amateur historians claiming that Freemasonry goes back to things like the pyramids of Giza and Stonehenge, and there's a reaction, a kind of anxiety to go back to, what is the very basics, what are the dates, what is the primary sources. And often the baby's been thrown out with the bathwater, and we started to kind of refuse to acknowledge or accept what the Freemasons themselves were saying about their heritage, and being quite reductive in our study of Freemasonry, reducing it down to politics and economics, and refusing to accept the spiritual basis of the members themselves. Freemasonry doesn't exist beyond its members, and I think particularly in the public discourse, people forget that these are human beings. These are people. These are actual people who face discrimination, who face abuse. And it's really Freemasonry is a thing that exists globally in very different, separate ways. You're talking about, I think it's easy for us to imagine a powerful elite. So it's okay to talk about these conspiracy or prejudiced ideas, but in reality you're talking the little farmer who's meeting in his village lodge, or right, the man in Africa who is the pinnacle of his month, might be go to a meeting and it's a sign of affluence. And to present these people as having a nefarious agenda, it really is, it should be treated in any other kind of prejudice, or treated with the same disdain as any kind of othering movement that's out there. Right.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. About the narratives that you brought up, different discussions. Some of the popular discussions about the origins of Freemasonry is that it's located in Egypt. You mentioned the Giza pyramids, but also that there has some kind of connection to early Hebrew teachings. The terms, I think it's Urim and Thummim. I'm probably saying these words incorrectly. I'm not well versed in Hebrew, but there are like 2 types of pillars that have particular names. and that these were very important. It had all these narratives that have to do with Solomon, King Solomon in ancient times. Are these just stories that I guess you could maybe label this kind of a revisionist type of thing, that people just thought, oh, these narratives sound like they might have something to do with building, like as Masons would be building with stone, building temples in the past, that there might be some link to that? Or is this all just kind of a fantasy?
Well, it's very much part of the Masonic culture. It comes from the stonemasons' trades, the medieval trades, and they would self-consciously align themselves to the builders of Solomon's temple. Okay. If you're trying, that is a mythic heritage that you were being initiated into. If we remember these times, the biblical. The knowledge of the Bible that people had at that time was probably all the knowledge that they had, and to make a link back to biblical stories was very important. And as we'll see in the history of Freemasonry, that link between contemporary events and biblical events is really, really strong. And Freemasons themselves, as part of their degrees and their ceremonies, will constantly try and reflect that narrative back. Masonic culture, Masonic philosophy is one based on the building of Solomon's temple and how that's understood, whether that's understood historically, spiritually, personally, or in the case of the Élus Coëns, on a cosmic level. You, as a Freemason, are trying to rebuild that temple, whether that's in a spiritual sense or in a global sense within the world. And the symbolism and the architecture of Solomon's temple, as it's portrayed in the Bible, is essentially your Masonic degrees. Almost everything that's within Freemasonry, ceremonially wise, will come back to the idea of building a sanctum sanctorum or a porch or passing through the gateway. And in the same way that Judaism had to cope with the destruction of the temple, much of that helps inform Masonic ritual. How do you rebuild the temple now that it's destroyed? This gets tied in with later traditions of the Knights Templar and the Crusaders camping upon the Temple Mound and what might have been found there, and how it was returned to Europe. And it was built on. But really, the earliest tradition of Freemasonry we called the craft. This is a 3-degree system. This is the lodges that you'll see in your local hometown that your grandfather might have been a member of. This is your 3 degrees, and that's the hundreds of years old tradition, the original craft, the original form of Freemasonry. Over time, Freemasonry becomes adapted, changed, people add more to it, it becomes more elaborate, and other degrees start to be created. Now, often these other degrees are portrayed or characterised as whimsical fancies, some kind of, they're reduced down to farces. But this is a form of spirituality. When we read the minutes of the meetings, when we read the degrees, when we read the accounts of these members, they really genuinely believe in this form of spirituality. And it's a whole storehouse of mysticism. It really is the last flower in Renaissance esotericism. That whole tradition has been stored within 18th century innovation as these new degrees are being created for lots of different reasons. Gentlemen, antiquarians are looking back at the Renaissance. They're looking at these books that, in light of Newton and in light of the Enlightenment, might be classed as rejected knowledge, and they're finding a storehouse within the degrees of Freemasonry. And the historical links between the two may be conjecture, but there's certainly a spiritual link between them, and many people who were interested in these ideas during the 18th century put them within the degrees. And Freemasonry as it exists today has this allure of occultism and esotericism that goes back to the 18th century. It was the same people who were involved. If you were interested in magic and mysticism and secret organisations, well, Freemasonry is real. It exists. It has a heritage going back hundreds of years already to the romantic northern mountains of Scotland. You have to remember, in the 18th century, Scotland national dress, its language, it's all illegal because of the Protestant ascendancy. If you're a French Catholic who loves the idea of a lost spiritual night in the northern mountains, it's a very heady cocktail. And when you add to that Hermeticism, Kabbalistic ideas, Gnosticism, and you already have a framework, a lodge, a building to meet in, like-minded men, a function, a system already in place, and it's easy to see how these things started to come together and coalesce into the tradition that we have today.
It's very interesting to hear you talk about it in that sense of men like my grandfather was a Mason, and that was my maternal grandfather. Although I learned more about Freemasonry when I was studying Western esotericism at the University of Amsterdam, my grandfather never talked about anything that had to do with esotericists, ideas or occult ideas. He always spoke of it in terms of, Christian, I guess, morals and values. And he would never talk to me about what it was that they did. And I was always very interested in it, but he was always so tight-lipped. And I was always so frustrated about that. But I guess what I'm curious is that for someone like my grandfather, who was, I guess you could label him the speculative Mason, because he was not a builder in that sense, stone builder by profession, how deep into esoteric thought do quote unquote regular Masons, such as my grandfather, maybe 40, 50 years ago, how deep into the esoteric are they actually delving in their meetings? Can you talk about that, or is that also forbidden?
No, certainly. This is where I would get into the idea of using the tools of religious studies to come and study Freemasonry. Just like any other spiritual tradition, you have a spectrum, and you have maybe like maybe somebody who's a Muslim, and at one end it may be just something they're born into, and they drink alcohol and eat pork, and you've got a far other extreme at the other end, and you may have Sufis, you may have extremists, you may have someone for which it's really just a question of heritage and culture. And Freemasonry is much the same. I think it's difficult for people to understand that Freemasonry's never had a purpose. It's never really had a meaning. And in place of that, people have come to it and reconstructed it to bring meaning and to bring purpose to it. And some regions of the world, take Scotland, for example, which I know about, are very clever. The Grand Lodge, the kind of overarching body for craft Freemasonry, are very clever in saying that they will not say what the signs and symbolism actually mean, that it's up to the individual to find out for themselves. It's a very broad church, and for some people it is a dining society. They come to it as a place to go to meet others and do charity. And for others, because the metaphors and the allegories of Solomon's Temple and the biblical imagery in general are so ripe for interpretation, you start to get other innovations within Freemasonry, changes, other degrees. And your grandfather would have been aware of something called the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry. This is the 33 degrees. Now, this is an example of how Freemasonry went in search of its own meaning. It starts to build extra 30 other degrees upon the traditional 3. The first 3 degrees of Freemasonry, the traditional history, is a moral system. It is basic Christian teachings generally about being a good person, reflecting in your life, helping your community, understanding that death makes you reevaluate life. But as time goes on, for different reasons, especially in the continent, 18th century France and Germany, we start to find other ideas coming in, more esoteric ideas being developed into these other orders of Freemasonry. And I think for the public, the idea is that this is a step up, that you're taking steps up, but it isn't. It's 3 steps and then sideways movements into things that you're interested in. So the additional 30 degrees doesn't mean that you're a more advanced Freemason beyond the average 3-degree Freemason. There is no higher degree than the 3rd degree, and everything else is a sideways movement for those that are interested in a more spiritual approach. Freemasonry, craft Freemasonry, the first 3 degrees in most European countries don't require a Christian religion. Anyone of any faith, as long as they believe in a supreme being, can be initiated into Freemasonry. As you go on to the more esoteric and move into the side orders, as are described, there's a requirement for a Christian faith. And it's an exploration of Christ and the Solomon's Temple and stories from the Bible. However, there are many Freemasons that would completely disagree with what I'm saying today. I think there's, especially within what we would call maybe the orthodox Masonic Grand Lodges, like the United Grand Lodge of England, not that long ago, a representative stood up and said, officially, ex cathedra, that Freemasonry had no spiritual tradition, that it was purely a social and moral teaching. There's lodges all over the world who aren't so au fait with the ideas of esotericism and occultism, who are trying to recruit the middle ground. Come and join all these nice guys. You'll get to network and meet. And the idea of esoteric ideas, occultism, in their mind is attached to witchcraft or Satanism and things. Yeah, so Freemasonry is a very diverse thing, and to essentialize it down, I would say for those who haven't a background in Freemasonry or know much about it, is to think of it as a spectrum. There is certainly a spiritual aspect of it, but there is certainly an everyday common charity focus as well, just as with Judaism, Islam, Christianity. There's extremes, and what it means for different people at different times and different places is very different. And then there's the sticky question of whether or not it's a religion. I would certainly not say it's a religion, but I think the tools of religious studies help us understand it better than trying to understand it in a way that we might try to understand the French Revolution or something like that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's been very helpful to kind of lay a foundation for our upcoming discussion about other things that have to do with Freemasonry. I think for what I was told, the little that I was told by my grandfather, it was basically that first degree about right living, being the best person that you can be, charitable person. And I did see that reflected in my grandfather's life. He definitely did strive to be a very kind, loving, generous, charitable person. So those things were very much reflected back to me, and he would talk about that, and that's where it kind of ended. So, but this conversation helps me to also place these other concepts and ideas that are out there as well into, as you said, a spectrum. So that's super helpful as we move ahead with our discussion. So talk now about the influences that Freemasonry has had on groups like the Theosophical Society, and use your article called Men of the Mountain that people can find on your website as a springboard for that discussion. So in your article, you point out that the notion of secret masters or Mahatmas found within Theosophy represent a conceptual link between the group and 18th century continental Masonic traditions, and also reflect that Charles Leadbeater, who was a second degree, I guess you could call a theosophist, his advancement of Krishnamurti is similar to an earlier event that took place in Masonic circles. So there's these similarities that can be made, these links that can be made. So could you first talk about how the notion of secret masters coming from the East as a type of intermediary being, and how this connects Theosophy to Freemasonry, and then we can move to the similarities between Leadbeater and the Masonic figure of Baron von Hund.
I think when we speak about esotericism in general, Freemasonry is always prevalent. It's surprising, and for me that the esoteric academia tends to, in the last 5 years or so, have shied away from Freemasonry. It doesn't seem to be something that's always spoke about. But for me, the history of esotericism has always been, at least in the last 400, 300 years, has either been reacting to or from Freemasonry. This is a genuine thing that existed. And when we talk about the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, Theosophy, all these other esoteric and occult orders, they're often trying to put forward secret societies. They're talking about orders that exist in the shadows, when Freemasonry is very much to the fore. It's in your grandfather's village, and they're either members of Masonic lodges or influenced or trying to remove themselves entirely from that influence. And Freemasonry is intrinsically tied up with the Rosicrucian tradition. And I think when we're going to talk about this subject, that's where we have to begin. One of the earliest references that we have in print of the esoteric Masonic religion, rituals or ceremonials is a poem from 1638, printed here in Scotland where I am, called The Muses Threadonody, and it mentions that we have the Mason's word alongside, we are brethren of the Rosy Cross, we have the Mason's word and the gift of second sight. So even from the very earliest days of Freemasonry, it's connected with the Rosicrucian Brotherhood. The Rosicrucians, of course, a secretive brotherhood that are guiding the events of the world towards some kind of greater spiritual revelation. This invisible brotherhood, and the Freemasons, through their signs and handshakes, can make themselves invisible, the invisible to one another, who knows. Now, this Rosicrucian idea of a secret brotherhood influences Freemasonry right through the 18th century, the 19th century, and today. And the most interesting manifestation of that for me is during 18th century France, the Jacobite exile of Bonnie Prince Charles Edward Stewart. Here you have an exiled king from a northern, mysterious romantic kingdom in exile in France. He is a true chivalric knight. Now, in the background of all this, you have these Masonic stories, myths of the Knights Templar and the Crusader Knights in Palestine who would dig down into the Temple Mount and found some secret. Now, what that secret is different for different people. Some people would say it's the secret of Gothic architecture that was brought back to Europe, or it could be the true name of God or some kind of gnosis. In any case, the myth goes that in time, the Knights Templar were persecuted by the Catholic Church. The King of Scotland at the time, Robert Bruce, had been excommunicated because he had killed a guy in a church. So the only place that the Knights Templar could go to find retreat was Scotland. So the sail up the west coast of Scotland, land in a place called Clelland, which is in the west coast of Scotland, where I'm from, Ayrshire. This is the oldest Masonic lodge in the world. And the belief is that the Knights Templar, with their secret knowledge, integrated themselves with the local stonemasons. And then that's how they started their new life, and eventually helped Robert the Bruce fight at Bannockburn as the shadowy White Knights that helped defeat the English. Centuries pass, it becomes a Masonic tradition. And then you have the Stewart kings who believe in their divine right to kingship, to rule. They brought together the Scottish and English crown. So in the same way that Solomon and David brought together Israel and Judea, this is happening within the Stewart lineage as well. And the Stewart propaganda promotes this. Remember, people use biblical languages to reflect contemporary events with biblical stories. So for many people, James VI, or the first of England, is part of the Solomonic line, part of a Davidic line, a divine right to rule, who's been deposed. And Charles Edward Stewart is part of that Solomonic line. He's exiled in France, and he's trying to gather support for the invasion with Scotland. And many French aristocrats are really excited about this idea of this hidden master, this hidden king who's gathering support to invade back into Scotland and take the British crown. And he uses Freemasonry as a recruiting clearinghouse, as a place to perpetuate the myth. Now you have, again, this complex interplay between political realities and spiritual realities. You've got these exiled Jacobite knights who are the inheritors of the Knights Templar that are employed in a Davidic line. This is all really, really exciting for your average French aristocrat. Charles Edward Stewart is hoping to reinstate Catholicism back into the British Isles again. If you're a Catholic French aristocrat who's part of this secret movement, all guided by this hidden chief in the highlands of the Scottish mountains. Now, this starts to become more prevalent in Germany. We have an order called the Order of the Strict Observance, which was a Masonic order that was chivalric in nature, that was deeply traditionalist, deeply conservative, and their leader, Baron von Hund, perpetuated the myth that he was initiated into a secret Knights Templar degree in 1743, I believe it is, by a shadowy figure known as the Knight of the Red Feather, who was clearly meant to be Charles Edward Stewart. And it was called the Rite of Strict Observance because its members had to strictly observe the orders of the secret chiefs, who were, of course, the Jacobite exiles. Now, this becomes political and spiritual, this idea of secret chiefs that are guiding events in Europe. Now, it starts to be interpreted in different ways. The order in which my book is about, the orders of the Élus Coëns, took this to a cosmic level, that it was going to be spiritual knights fighting for the good and the restoration of God's original intention for Earth, whereas other Masonic orders were fighting for a Catholic ascendancy back in Scotland and in Britain. So this idea becomes very fashionable and starts to change in different ways. You start to have people like Cagliostro or Saint Germain, who are Masonic myths, and a central part of the Masonic teaching is the idea of taking a rough ashlar, which is an unhewn stone, and turning it into a perfect ashlar, which is a cut stone for building. And this has alchemical significance for people, and people like Cagliostro are teaching the idea that Masonry, or forms of Masonry, was an alchemical process to regenerate not just a divine right of a king, but the divine right of man in general, to restore man. That Masonry could be used as a way to elevate a human being to a perfected individual. And the Élus Coën rite, the Masonic ritual, becomes something where you have to reconcile yourself to your holy guardian angel. And once you have reconciled yourself to your holy guardian angel, you can become a spiritual elite who are working to cause what is basically an apocalypse, a whole regeneration of the earth. Now, this again goes on into the 19th century. You've got people like Frederick Hockley, the spiritualist Frederick Hockley, who are contacting angels through the Urim and Thummim that you mentioned at the beginning, this idea of an alchemical stone in which you can communicate with spirits or the divine will of God and are able to transform either yourself or the universe. You also have what's known as the Masonic Golden Rosencrantz, which was an alchemical Masonic order, which again believed in secret chiefs guiding the earth and the spiritual development of man in the eastern part of the world, out in China, in Asia, all of which feeds into the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Mathers, Crowley are all buying into this because they are all Freemasons. Every founding member of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn was a Freemason. The rituals and the ceremonies of the Golden Dawn are based on Masonic Rosicrucian degrees. Crowley takes this idea. The Golden Dawn are at a time when people are starting to look towards Eastern horizons for the origins of perennial wisdom, and Theosophy is a reaction to that. But it's very much part of this longer heritage of secret chiefs, intermediary beings in far-off lands, whether that's the mountains of Tibet or the mountains of Scotland. You can see that there's a motif there that changes, and it's whether it's political, spiritual, or personal. There's a whole heritage there that Blavatsky and the Theosophists are drawn from, and it all has its roots in Freemasonry.
So in this sense, the advancement of Krishnamurti as a type of Messiah figure led me to then was advancing the idea of Krishnamurti as being an advanced human that is a master in that sense. Mm-hmm. As Charles Stewart was considered to be a master as well. I see. Mm. So that is the link to between those two, I guess, traditions. But very interesting that they were mentioning the holy guardian angel, and I mean, whenever I hear that, I think of Crowley. But of course, it came before Crowley. He took it from an earlier source. Of course, it's always the way. And I've been reading a lot of material lately, also for other interviews that I'm preparing. And it does seem like Freemasonry is always popping up as the source of inspiration for other people's concepts or philosophies or trains of thought. That there always seems to be this seed that's germinating out of Freemasonry, which I find to be very, very interesting. And this is also, again, this conversation now is super helpful in really fleshing out all those little areas that have always been kind of in the shadows that now there's light being shown on them now, and everything's starting to fall into place for me, at least a little bit. I mean, not of course this is a very, very complex topic that we're talking about. But thanks for explaining that. And for the listeners, please visit Stewart's website to read the article in full. I'll make sure to include the link to the website in the program notes. So, as Freemasonry always seems to be involved, as you had already mentioned, in conspiracy theories, especially in the United States, I'd like to use Michael Barkun's Chapter 8, entitled UFOs and the Search for Scapegoats, Anti-Catholicism and Anti-Masonry, from his book, A Culture of Conspiracy, as a specific case study in order to discuss why the Freemasons often seem to be targets, the target of conspiracy theories. Michael Barkun discusses several things in his chapter, but I'll just pick out a few that we can talk about here. So to start with a bit of context, Barkun discusses how Masons are linked to the notion of the New World Order. This is a term that's always floating around in conspiracy circles. And New World Order ideas are contained within many UFO conspiracies. And these conspiracies draw upon and contain biases of American nativism, which is an intense opposition or fear of quote-unquote foreign people or religions. And these fears seem to find a location in three groups: the Catholics, the Freemasons, and the Jews. And although these groups are deemed separate from each other and most oftentimes in opposition to each other, these secret organizations that's made up of these three groups are often seen to cooperate with each other as well in order to realize their alleged goals of world domination through manipulation. So, UFO conspiracies. Now we're starting to get a little a little bit crazier here. I mean, I don't know, maybe not crazy, but a little bit stranger, I guess. UFO conspiracies make an appearance with the claims that high-ranking governmental officials, such as President George H.W. Bush and Queen Elizabeth, are actually reptilian aliens that can shapeshift. Freemasonry, of course, is linked to this by conspiracy authors such as David Icke, who claims that Freemasonry is the core of what he calls the Luciferian Illuminati. This particular branch is claimed to be associated with the reptilians. So we can see how this is all connected. So now, with that as the foundation, one of the more bizarre conspiracies out there centers on the Denver, Colorado airport terminal. Literature on this claims that this terminal is filled with Masonic symbols that act as a, quote, homing beacon to allow alien spaceships to fly directly into the terminal's Great Hall, end quote. That's quoting Barkun. This idea is part of a larger theory that claims a secret world government consisting of human New World Order members and reptilians are operating underneath the Denver Airport terminal. So, Stewart, what are your thoughts about such claims? Why do you think that Freemasons are always the target for conspiracies such as this one, like the Denver airport idea? And what, in your opinion, motivates people to believe that Freemasonry is evil?
Historically, I think Freemasonry has always been subject to prejudice and always been subject to some kind of conspiracy. Right back into the 18th century, you have different authors like John Robinson who were putting out different ideas that the Freemasons had caused the French Revolution, that had been involved in that idea. Well, I mean, I suppose you could look back and, the Masonic involvement in the Jacobite court in France. You can see how some of these ideas come from. And as mentioned, the earliest references we have to any kind of esoteric Masonic ritual is known as the Mason's Word. And that's already connected with the bread under the Rosy Cross, which itself was a conspiracy. That connection between Rosicrucianism and Freemasonry is always going to elucidate some kind of idea of a secret conspiracy, an unknown hand that's operating. And the Masons themselves have benefit from that and been attacked. There's reasons for and against why that might have been perpetuated by Masons themselves. I think for me, coming from someone who's Scottish and interested in Freemasonry, when I was starting to be interested in looking at it, it was always American sources. America seems to be the yardstick of what Freemasonry is, and the 33-degree Scottish Rite Masons, which incidentally has nothing to do with Scotland. It was a French invention by people who believed it. Freemasonry came from Scotland, and that's where the name comes from. The American preoccupation and the American style of Freemasonry is so completely different from the rest of the world. And the idea that it's a Catholic conspiracy, like where I'm from a small Scottish town in the west coast of Scotland, and the Freemasonry is a part of the culture there. in Ayrshire. It's been there for hundreds of years, and it's very much rooted in the local tradition. But there's also a tradition that it's a front for a Protestant organisation known as the Orange Order, who were celebrate King William of Orange's Protestant ascendancy in Scotland in the 16th century, and they often march. It might be something you've seen yourself in Amsterdam, the Orange Order, that imagery to do with suppressing Catholic influence in Scotland, and they'll march with pipe bands and that type of thing through the town, and often past chapels and Catholic areas to provoke. And it's often seen as a kind of a bigoted, kind of violent organisation. Now, the reality of that's maybe a bit different, but that's definitely the perception. And Freemasonry seems to be, in many people's minds in the west of Scotland, a front for that organisation. So for me to hear that it's a Jesuit conspiracy, it's quite contradictory compared to what the rest of the world believe. But of course, the American culture is the kind of dominant culture, especially when we're speaking about Freemasonry, and much of the idea of it is to do with Dan Brown and the films, and that kind of culture really feeds into it. I think if we look at it in a deeper level, the American preoccupation with the separation of church and state, I think, is quite a big idea. And when you're talking about the founding fathers being a member of some kind of, at very least, spiritual organisation that are somehow at the heart of the state, I think that anxiety of religion and state coming together in some kind of underhand way is a big part of it. I also think evangelicalism would play a big part. Again, any kind of hierarchy or organisation between you and a form of spirituality, there's going to be some kind of resentment against that. These conspiracy theories have led to the death of thousands of Freemasons. Hitler, Franco, Mussolini, they all put Freemasons in camps. The end point of these stories, we're talking about UFOs and lizard people, but the end point is concentration camps. And I think it's important to realise that you're talking about human beings. Freemasonry is banned in China. You've got lodges in Hong Kong today. In the Muslim world, apart from the Lebanon and Morocco, most masonry is suppressed or attacked. Hamas described Freemasonry as a network of spies and Jews trying to destroy and promote the Zionist cause. Now, you've got there, the Hamas saying the same thing as some conservative evangelical groups. This is a common ground. And as the end point, you're speaking about people like your grandfather, who would be gleefully rounded up, as many were. And there's really poignant artifacts and manuscripts and minute books of Masons continuing to try to hold lodge meetings within concentration camps. This is as I say, it can be more than a dining society, more than a social club. It's a form of, at least in Northern Europe, a form of indigenous spirituality that's often ridiculed because the perception is it's populated by an elite, but the reality is it's a much more rooted indigenous culture, and the internet perception of it is very skewed towards American culture, whereas if you go to a lodge in India, in Africa, in Malaysia, it's a completely different environment. But there is always some kind of belief that they're up to nefarious ends. The actual reality is alarmingly, it's banal, really. It's for most people. But when you don't have or put forward an agenda, when you don't have a purpose, when you don't have even a solid confirmation of what your symbolism means, that void is filled by other people's ideas.
I see. Good point. Very good point. And even if it is a bizarre story about shape-shifting reptilians, you make a really interesting point that in the end, it comes down to the people themselves, and that, a marginalized group, actually, that I guess I didn't think of it in those terms in the United States so much, but your comment about the Hamas leader, I hadn't heard that before, so that really struck home to me that, this is a really, This is a widespread belief about Freemasons, and even if it is this, the one end of the spectrum where we're talking about UFOs and all of these, very, very out of this world narratives, it does seem to always link back to real people behind these stories. So.
I mean, even the outlandish, you're quite, lizard people, it's a narrative that quite literally dehumanizes individuals. They're no longer human, that the lizards. Any Masonic conspiracy, if you replace the word Mason with Jew, it's very much an old trope. Yeah. That's very, very interesting points that you're making. And it really gives a lot more nuance to the discussion, and not just this wacky ideas about aliens and underground bunkers and secret organizations wanting to rule and all of that. So that puts it into a different perspective for me. So I thanks for that. That's it's broadening my perspectives here. So it's always a good thing. Join us for part 2, where we delve into the elect monastic group of the Élus Coëns, their history, the inner workings of the group, why they believed the need for magical warfare, and what happened to them.